Good afternoon, good morning to wherever you're dialing in from to this panel session today, where we're going to be discussing how AI can impact industry, from CROs to patients to pharmaceutical companies, how RWE can improve orphan drug development and access. We're very pleased to be hosted by Orphan from World Orphan Drug Congress. And of course, this is all in relationship to Rare Disease Day that was this weekend. And as probably everyone has seen, there's a lot of activity online for that, which is great to see. So without much more ado, I'm going to share my screen and welcome the presenters today. We've got a really, really wonderful panel for you today. We've got Javier Jimenez, who is Executive Vice President for Real World Evidence from Syneos Health. Syneos is a fully integrated service provider in the pharmaceutical and health industry. So welcome, Javier. Thanks for attending. We also have Matt Eagles, who's Head of Patient Engagement at Havas Links, who's going to be bringing a patient perspective for us today. And then we also have, we're honored to have Martin Zimmermann as well, who's Global Head of Regulatory Affairs at Alexion, who are very, very clearly focused on rare diseases today. So I'd like to welcome you all to this session. I'm going to be hosting and moderating this session. I'm Christopher Rudolph, I'm the CEO of Evolve Global, and we provide an AI or data science way of helping find patients and patient cohorts who have rare diseases and bringing about their journey to a diagnostic pathway and hopefully to treatment. The key question, why are we talking about real-world evidence for rare disease, World Rare Disease Day? The reason I think it's really important to talk about this is because rare disease and orphan drug development is probably at the forefront of using real-world evidence to prove out its value. And that's because of the actual implicit challenges in rare diseases where the populations are extremely sparse and the disease onset often is extremely heterogeneous or difficult. The symptoms are really difficult for clinicians to understand. And so real-world evidence is one way of trying to find those commonalities between a very diverse set of patients, but also very sparse and distributed set of patients around the world. And it presents a challenge for everyone in this space. So that's why we're going to be talking about that today. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about what Evolve does on one slide very quickly. What we do by looking at this heterogeneity and understanding not just the disease, but understanding the patients, and also understanding the clinical system in which they're in, we provide very accurate patient finding. And that allows us then to create moments when you can get the attention of a clinician at the right time, when you can actually introduce really targeted education and learning about that disease that's presenting in front of them with that patient right there and then. And the other thing we do is we also detect the missing data points that the clinicians may not have at their fingertips. Because for all of us, there's a lot of data missing in our electronic health records. So what we do is we predict at the patient level what's missing, what the clinician needs to find out more about that patient in order to be able to get them to a targeted earlier diagnosis. And so we're very passionate about what we do. Hopefully that'll come across. What we do is pretty unique. But what's more unique is the way that we do this in a collaborative way, where you have to work with all the different stakeholders. So what we're going to talk about today a little bit is what is real-world evidence and real-world data that it comes from, and why is that more and more of a challenge now and more of an opportunity as well. And we're going to talk about some of the themes to do with that as well. So first of all, real-world data is primary data, which is collected specifically from research purposes. So mainly it tends to be clinical data for the EHR, EMR data, that sort of thing. It could be medical claims data, which is to do with your drug treatment, the prescriptions, etc. And it can do with the actual medications, so the orders, the medication, the dosing, etc. And that's fairly typical standard data. But what we're seeing increasingly is that we're having secondary data sources brought in for real-world evidence, which is really things around patient-reported outcomes, patient-reported data, social media could be included in there, mobile health, fitness trackers, medical apps, all those sorts of things, and even family history. and then we add into that maybe some things which are associated to the clinical data as literature, so the summarized insights and writing and reporting, and then of course environmental factors, which could be anything from, for example, unloading of soybeans in Barcelona, which increases the impact on cancer, on asthma sufferers, for example, to your workplace health. It could be anything like that. And so what we're seeing, I think, as well, is the coming together of these two different areas of data, which is maybe more personal versus medical, when you see things like molecular profiling at the individual level also happening. So bringing together these two medical areas and now with the personal areas, and those personal areas expanding all the time, is presenting all sorts of challenges and opportunities. So I'm gonna now, having made the introduction and set the scene, really swap back to the panel and welcome you all properly now. So hello everyone.
Hello.
And just having sort of painted that picture of the vast array of possible different data sources that we now consider as evidence, I wanted to really start by asking, from the various perspectives that you have, whether that is the everyday life now, or if it's not now, do we really see that coming? So perhaps Martine, maybe you'd like to kick off.
Okay, so thank you, Chris, and hello everybody. So very happy to be here. Rare Disease Week. Let's call it Rare Disease Week. It was on Sunday, and while we're not together, I think it's just super cool to be here and in this panel. And we had a lot of fun actually preparing for this conversation, and I think you will all enjoy it. So to the point, those data, right? And I think you all got on Chris' slide that yes, there is data available. There is a wealth of data available. Some could say it's not enough. It's never enough, okay? But I think we have to use those data adequately and appropriately to build development plans to hopefully bring new medicine quicker to the patient, because there is always a patient there, a patient with tremendous unmet medical need. But we know the unmet medical need because those patients are sick. But what are they? What are they looking for? So I think the real world evidence is helping us to understand what we need to demonstrate. And if we use I call it the mantra, and it's an FDA thing, you need to demonstrate how the patient functions, feels, and survives. It's only by looking at this real world data and speaking with the patient, and I will hand over to Matt in a minute, but speaking to the patients and understanding those things, that then we can build a relevant development plan, hopefully with an external control arm, okay? And then demonstrate benefit risk, okay? So Matt, do you want to add something? I know you're passionate about that and you can't wait to speak here.
Yeah. Real world evidence in AI really excite me, simply because I've lived with a rare disease for 46 years. I was actually diagnosed with juvenile onset Parkinson's disease in 1975. Now, back then, this data simply wasn't available, wasn't shared. Now, this is what really excites me as well. Speaking to a lady like Martine, who to patients and to many people involved in regulatory, they're seen as the bad eggs, but in fact, they're not. Particularly in rare disease, they are the facilitators of change. And I think AI and collecting the right evidence and the right data will promote a conversation which will help it'll benefit everybody. And I think from a patient perspective, we have got to get away from this. Regulators are bad. They're not, they're facilitators of change.
Well, I will let others speak, but I could respond here a lot, but maybe others, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So Javier.
Yes. So no. First of all, thank you for having the opportunity today to share this time with all of you. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss about real world evidence, in particular in rare disease. Real world evidence is my passion. I have been working in this space around 20 years now, and I have seen the full evolution of real world evidence, where we started just with the only way to collect real world evidence was about prospective registries and going to the sites and the patient to collect the information to the situation where we are today. As you mentioned, the availability of data and technology have grown massively. And now we are starting to have the opportunity to integrate all this kind of data from data that is collected in the traditional registry approach or traditional prospective observational approach to data that is more passively collected in the interaction of the patient with the healthcare system, electronic healthcare record claim. But probably in the last 5 years, there has been even a boom of data that is collected, I will say, between the time that the patient have an interaction with the healthcare system in the day-to-day. It's all this information that now is available through devices, tracers, digital footprint of patient, and making sense of all this information is really critical to provide a really tailored solution for each particular patient situation. And here is where even the traditional ways of analyzing data is not enough anymore, and we need to work into apply machine learning, artificial intelligence to be able to make sense of this massive amount of data. And if we think in rare disease, this is really critical because the reality is that the heterogeneity of patients for each disease is really high. And we really need to understand the patient journey, the patient day-to-day, and how to tailor our solution to the individual patient, and having this kind of data and analytic capabilities can really be a game changer in this situation.
And those are really, really great points. And one of the things we've seen is that in terms of the number, I mean, we have a database of rare diseases that we look at and maintain, which is about 8,233 at the moment, and with 23,000 synonyms. And so for clinicians, it's impossible to know them all. And when we look at the electronic health record, we see there are well over 50,000 data points. And to put that in context, that's like looking at all the stars in 12 complete night skies. So 12 galaxies, 12 nights, and having to find the patterns in there, it's actually impossible to do that. And we've reached that point where we as human beings need help. But the most important thing is I think the piece you've touched is that this is actually data about us as people and the variability that we have. So the infinite number of combinations are also just mind-boggling. So we have to make sense of that. And that means that it allows us all to be ourselves and to be individuals. And we were talking about this before we came on, which is the important change in recognizing rare diseases and allowing people to express themselves, as you were saying, Matt, I think was important. But that expression, in terms of capturing that expression and turning that into data points that we can use as evidence, is really what we're talking about. So it's about allowing us to be present.
Yeah, but totally agree. Okay, but again here, you need to find, and every person is different, right? Every rare disease patient is different. Sometimes the genotype is the same, but the phenotype is different, and then it's a flurry of different things. And then, yes, as I was saying, you have a lot of data, different data points, but where can you find commonalities? And I think this is also where artificial intelligence or talking to people and physicians, you can find common points, which then you would explore in your development program, because you cannot study every single patient. Otherwise, you will never reach the target, right? So I think it's a difficult, okay, nothing is easy, but the combination of the flurry of data and then finding some common grounds to demonstrate early, okay? Maybe have conditional approval, and then continue with real-world evidence to generate data, okay? I think this is the important point. And to your point, Matt, earlier, yes, regulators can no longer be seen as showstoppers or roadblocks. I was saying as we were preparing, the COVID time, as bad as it is, has brought some, I mean, let's say positive things or encouraging things with more flexibility. So I think we should really capture those things and continue to build on this flexibility that we're seeing. And believe me, we will be vocal in the industry with that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Christopher, can I just say,
yeah,
am I right in thinking that AI will enable us to pretty much triage the patient's requirements into what's most important to them?
Yeah.
Is that how it kind of how it works? Because I think that way you can discover which things matter the most to the most patients. And as Martine so very kindly said, there's got to be similarities between rare disease patients.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so the challenge with small populations, very dispersed, spread widely in different systems, is the fact that everyone is described differently, but in fact there are these commonalities.
Yeah.
And in fact what's important for a patient and what a patient's experience is often very different to what we think it is. And we can even pick that up in data. Yeah. Without having to ask every single patient every single nuance, you can already start seeing those things. So we've already seen for diseases where clinicians will think that the patients are sitting in maybe internal medicine clinic. In fact, they're not. They're sitting in neurology, for example.
Yeah.
They're being undiagnosed for 5 to 10 years in that department. We see that disease by disease happening. So you're getting insights which you never had before from the data, because you can see those patterns across a vast, population scales across many different countries. And so, yeah, it is talking about that. So from our perspective, we do see those patterns, and those are human learning insights, not AI. It's not artificial intelligence. We are learning from the machine, and the machine is telling us what we didn't see before. And that's really important because it's educating us, we're learning, and we're pushing the boundaries of science further forward. But I think the interesting thing is what Martine is also saying is the ability to start sooner, build evidence sooner, and then to look at how you're going to continue to build that evidence over the lifetime of a product and continue to grow and adapt is really important as you bring more patients on board. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to build on that comment, and it's about sometimes the misconception that real-world evidence only happens when you have the product in the market, is post-commercialization, post-authorization, when the reality, and in particular in rare disease, starting working in real-world evidence as soon as possible is critical. And it's come back to your point, Matt, about understanding what is the patient journey, understanding what are the outcomes of interest for the patient, for caregiver, what do you need to measure in the clinical trial, what is the disease progression. So where can you make an impact, and where is the need for the development? You really need that information if you want to do a clinical development that is tailored to the needs of the patient, and not just to have the product approved, but a product that make a difference for patients. So it's very important really to start building those real-world evidence plans as soon as possible, and start, as you mentioned, also start working through the clinical development. There is more and more evidence of the use of real-world evidence even to support and enhance clinical trial, and then continue when the product is in the market. But it should start really early in the clinical development.
But I think also, because regulators are here, and sometimes it's not the easiest thing, but also in this real world evidence, you need to have some rigor. And I think this is why we have CROs and to help us, right? And because the real world data, the real world registries, whatever they are, cannot be like a Swiss cheese, right? Because if you have like a lot of holes, then it jeopardizes the value and the regulatory value, let's say. And using this as a comparative arm because you have a lot of missing data. So I think as very often in life, when you do something, you do it, right? And you do it seriously. So I think you always need to think that with the aim in mind. So I'm going to collect real world evidence, but let's assume that I'm going to use it and for which purpose I'm going to use it, right? Because if you don't do that, then you can build a development program knowing that there is a database somewhere. And then when you look at it, what is it? It's an Excel spreadsheet and you cannot really build it. And then as a company, we need to sponsor a new natural history study. And then unfortunately, timelines will be impacted. So I think this is easy to say, okay, not easy to do. When we capture, we have to capture consistently, right?
Yeah. I think you brought us onto another topic, which is about engagement and consent and also privacy, because we're actually asking for a lot of trust for people to share a lot of personal data now.
Yeah.
And so Matt, I'd like to come back to you on that. The privacy, the consent, the trust, all that side of things, and actually keeping the engagement and making sure that we get that data consistently throughout.
Interestingly, this is very pertinent to a post I've just recently posted on LinkedIn. I did it to sort of show how difficult it can be living with Parkinson's, and in particular, living with dyskinesia, which are involuntary movements. Now, although when we were discussing before we came live, Martine said I was brave, I personally don't feel I was being brave. I was being honest, and I really wanted people in the audience to experience what I go through virtually every single meal time, which is a fact, and I have done for a number of years, so I don't get many people sitting next to me at meal times, apart from my dog. But basically, I think not enough patients are, and this is their choice, and it's also my choice to be brave. I've got to the stage where I really have something to give back after 46 years of superb help from the pharma companies, from the medics. I feel I owe it to give back to the people that have helped me. But I understand not everybody has the desire to do this. They feel people who've been brought up in a digital world, which, it was just getting going when I was growing up, but we didn't have access to half the data that we do now. We couldn't video our own symptoms and share them. We couldn't share our stories online. And that to me it's very empowering as a patient, but also it's kind of like facilitates transparency and an honesty, which we would like as a patient community to see in pharma and with HCPs as well. Because we're just showing our daily lives, we're showing off how these diseases and how you can potentially help us. We're almost kind of selling the disease to people, for want of a better word. And to sell it, you've got to show it in all its glory, for want of a better word. And if you can do that, then that's great. But for many, many people, it's a tough call. Having symptoms in itself is difficult enough. for many people. But to be able to share them, I personally think is empowering, and it helps me. And it helps a lot of patients that I know in the community, but it isn't for everybody. And it's a big call for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah, which that's perfect. Thank you very much, because I think that takes us perfectly to the place of trust and confidence in what's happening. And Javier, you've probably got some insights into things like permissions and consent.
Yes, yes. A couple of comments. The first one is just building on your comment, Matt, about the importance of understanding the patient situation and how can we really. Part of this trust is about when we start designing our studies and our program, how do we take into consideration those situations and those particularities to design the study in a way that is, or registries or everything, in a way that is less disruptive for patients. So understanding the patient journey, the patient day-to-day, and design the study and implement the study in a way that it could be easier for patients to participate is very important. I think that sometimes we forget how difficult it could be for patients just to go through all the test, situation, travel, whenever we ask for the patient to participate in the trial. So we are implementing more and more solutions that bring the research to the patient instead of bringing the patient to the site. And I think that COVID has been an accelerator this area and bringing more opportunities to bring activities closer to the patient, disrupting their life in the lower possible. Regarding the trust and the permission for the use of the data, usually we work with fully anonymized data, but this is tricky, a little more tricky with rare disease because the number of patients is small, so it's a little more difficult even how do you keep all the privacy for the patient on this situation. So there is probably when in traditional research, the trust of patient on sharing data is almost given. Here, need to be even stronger. The protection of the data of the patient need to be stronger because the number are smaller. On the other hand, you need the integration of the data to be able to have enough data. So how do we find this balance? For example, about using all previous data from previous study to gain knowledge for future studies. And we find sometimes the difficulty is that when you are trying to reanalyze some of previous studies, the informed consent was built in a way that only allowed to analyze this data for this particular study, not for the future. So we need to evolve, I will say, the contract between research and the patient to evolve those informed consent of those situations to be able to use the data in the best way, of course, always protecting the patient privacy and the patient right, but helping to advance research.
Great. No, that's fantastic. And I think you also touched on a piece which I think is interesting because thinking about things like 6-minute walk test for Duchenne, which seems now almost inhuman to most of us, whereas that was just the standard and the only thing to measure. In terms of actually taking endpoints and when you're looking at a lot of data, how adaptive do you think we can be about picking new endpoints as we gather more evidence?
I think that we can, there is going to be a big evolution on this area. You see some of the technology companies that are working on devices that are starting even to build those devices ready for research. So we have more and more validity of the data that is coming from device, from the day-to-day. And at some point, it's even more important because it's more continuous information. So versus having just one point of measure when the patient go to the healthcare provider, if you are able to have all this information almost every day, 24 hours per day, is going to be more and more used. It will require, of course, studies for the validation of those digital biomarkers, but I think that is going to happen more and more. It's pretty clear even that regulators are more and more open for those opportunities. And again, some of the samples that you put, where you can just have some of the measure done at home based on the estimation of the life of the patient in the day-to-day, versus having to have the patient traveling to a site, to have a 1 hour drive, to have half an hour visit, or whenever. Just imagine the difference for patient. And the point is on this area that is coming back to the previous point, that the amount of data is going to be massive. We need to be able to make sense of this data, but we need to also to be able to understand those machine learning or artificial intelligence algorithms, avoid that those are black box, so that we can explain why we make those relationships.
It's a really, really great point. In fact, we specifically, all the algorithms are ultimately very complex when you're looking at rare events by the very nature of the problem. And because you're looking at multiple different types of patients who have different heterogeneous symptom onset, you've got a very rare disease, you've got extremely messy, gappy data. But one of the things that we found is that you can actually create transparency by creating what we call interpretable models from the black box. And those interpretable models are understandable by clinicians. And so you can explain to the clinician why a certain patient is suspected of having a certain disease, because you pull the certain things that are meaningful to the clinician out, which helps you, as you validate, to go and build that trust. And I think that's really important, not just for clinicians, but for every stakeholder, that you can create that transparency. And I think that's a really, really important point.
I think to this, yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to build on this one. I mean, once you have this algorithm and you start developing or putting together a development program, then it's time also to go and see the regulators and show them, okay? Because then if you start and then you're going to enter into validation issues, how relevant is this? You know, is this really addressing how the patient feels, functions, and survives piece? So as you were saying, they're all stakeholders, right? Mm-hmm. So once you have some level of understanding, and then the mechanism of action of your drug and how you plug the mechanism of action of your drug and the pathophysiological mechanism, right? And then what you can demonstrate, which that is impactful for the patients, which you get from what we're talking about, then I think it's time to engage with regulators, mm-hmm. agree, and then do it, right? With the smallest amount of patients, hopefully, to do that, right? Matt?
Totally agree. Totally agree. Sorry, that I can't. It's unusual for me to sort of agree with the point, but I do. I really do. So that's all I can say, really.
Yeah, and I think it's you brought that point of the multi-stakeholder piece, sort of everyone having to come together around the patient. So this is all about design thinking and actually working around the patient and focusing on what the outcome is you're trying to show and improve upon. And I think that means you need to start earlier. I agree with you 100%. Yep. We all agree now that this real world evidence isn't that thing of, oh, now I've got the drug in the market, off we go. It's actually knowing it already, evidencing it early, and showing and getting trust in the regulators that you're actually taking a really sensible approach about this. But no one can do all of it. So everyone has to do their piece. And so we need the patients involved. We need, the patient groups involved. We need everyone to be on board. And so it makes it ultimately into a more complex but more fulfilling type of project. I'm looking at the time, and we did promise that we'd have some questions from the audience as well, because I think I'm not sure how many people are watching, but there are certainly some questions coming in. And I thought I might just interject a couple of questions from the audience for us, and then we can carry on talking, if that's okay. So the first question we had that came in today was, when we're planning translational projects in a lab, how do we engage at that point early on with patients? Knowing that we can't actually already start any clinical steps? I think that's quite an interesting question. So, Martin, have you any thoughts on that? I mean, I have.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, I think you need to develop the relationship with the patient communities. You need to develop a shared purpose. And if once you have a shared purpose, people will invest in what you're doing. And I think that's crucial, because once people invest, I mean, at the end of the day, now we've gone digital. More and more patients are investing in their own healthcare, and they're expecting the companies that they're dealing, or the company like pharma companies, HCPs, to invest as much time as they are. So the more time that the patient invests, the more time they kind of expect pharma and HCPs to invest as well. So if you can, even if you're not going to get to your desired outcome, as long as you communicate that with them, then they know what the situation is. And I think that's overcoming a huge hurdle, which is fear. Don't be afraid of giving bad news, because you can move on from that and go and take the next step.
Yeah, I'm Martine, you were going to say, jump in there.
Yeah, I was about to say, and I really like, and I mean this, you may think it's a bit narrow, but I always, because when I build a regulatory dossier, you build a story, right? And these building blocks for me is the disease, the pathophysiological mechanism of the disease and how it expresses, and then a mechanism of action of a drug. Of course, if you have a gene therapy, you believe it's going to fix it, okay? I don't know if you do a lot of translational medicine when you decide to go on a pure gene therapy thing when you fix it. But let's imagine something else, a new enzyme replacement therapy, a new whatever. So here you have a mechanism of action that is going to target one aspect of the disease. And I think this is the point where, and Matt is right, don't be shy, engage with the patients, because I have seen around me and the disease we're working on in my company, patients are super knowledgeable.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right, Martine. Oh, I think Martine's just spoke a second. But no, I'll pick up on that. I think it's really important to engage early on, because in fact, by engaging early on, you're already learning more about the disease. Because often when you're in this early stage, before you cross the abyss into clinical, the amount of literature, the amount of data on the disease is very low anyway. So you can only learn more. And so I think the engagement is really, really interesting at that point. And it is important to look for those communities. So Javier.
Yes, no, I just want to build on that. Is true. It's very important, because even trying to understand how are you going to develop that targeted drug, what are the symptoms for the patient that create more disruption for them, what is really relevant for the patient, because sometimes the risk is that we do just, I will say, for science, is what science tells you to do, but need to be focused on what do we want to achieve, and this is what is relevant for patient. What are the symptoms of the disease that are creating most disruption? How the disease progress? What is more worry for the patient? And this could help you to really even start thinking what should be your clinical development program later.
Great. While we're waiting for Martine to come back on, I'll move on to another question. So from the audience, real-world evidence and AI has great promise, but how do we solve the issue of making data available? There are both legal and ethical hindrances to this data, as it will most likely need to be shared both within and without between countries. What are the biggest hurdles and the best ways to get around or over these hurdles? Well, I'll let you talk first to that, Javier, and then I can definitely.
Yes, so we say that, for example, privacy legislation could be different across countries, and some countries could be more, had more difficulties to share the data outside the country, and you need to be careful when you are managing this kind of data with all this kind of legislation. My experience with patients are usually much more than willing to share the data because they know that is relevant and are happy to share the data. It's some way is part of our responsibility to make sure that this data is used properly and that is managed properly with the highest standard for privacy. So the barrier is true in terms of different legislation to use the data, but the technology is also advancing, and we are starting to see situations where, in fact, you don't need the data to be to go out of a particular site or a particular country. You can start building those federated models where, in some way, you send the request, the algorithms, the analytic request to the different data set. The data stay on their particular environment to make sure that is managed properly, and you only have the outcome, and you can integrate the analytic across different diseases. So I think, different database of different areas. It's evolving. There will be more, but I think that the technology is going to help to protect the patient level data.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because it's a real concern that a lot of people have. So our company, for example, is a no data company. We have no data. What we actually do is we put algorithms into data. So we don't need to take any data out at all. Yeah. All that comes out is a model, which is an aggregate anonymized thing. So there is no actual patient data that moves around. So that way you avoid a lot of the things. So I think we need to think about this as privacy by design. We are all people who are all patients at some point in our lives. So we're protecting our own data as well. That's how I look at it. And I say, well, you've got to also work within and be very clear about the regulatory constraints in every single, as Javier was saying, in every single environment that you're working in. So you work within those constraints very, very clearly. And so working with the right partners who have the right processes and procedures and controls in place is absolutely important. And there are more and more of those around the world. We work with population scale data sets in many countries, and it's something you can do without actually having to take any patient data out, okay? Which is really amazing. And the question 5 was how to ensure that AI projects will be fully compliant with any patient data protection regulation. Precisely that's what you have to think about. In fact, it's important also to know that in some jurisdictions, you cannot build a model without full consent of every individual that you're learning from. Okay, so you have to think about all of those things when you're looking at anything. One of the things we do is we realize that the actual accuracy of a model is dependent on the country. And so we are actually quite reluctant even to move models around because they're not as accurate, they don't work as well. So we build the model country by country, and that way the models stay even in the country themselves. We can learn the high level data of the model from one country to another, so you don't have to do the same work every time, but you don't need to move any patient data at all.
Yeah, yes, and I think that in any case, we need to start preparing for the future, a future where the patient will be the one controlling their data, and where the technology could allow the patient to understand how their data is being used, when it's used, and to give consent or not to use the data, depending what is the use of the data. So I think that there is more and more opportunity for the patient to have access for their full clinical data, but there is plenty of additional data that the patient is already generated and is not on the traditional sources. So there will be, I'm convinced that in the future we'll see the patient having, I will say, the opportunity to connect all the different data that is generated by them and provide consent directly to use or not for each particular situation, if this is reasonable for being used and that this can be done in an easy way.
Yeah.
Can I just put a little put an idea forward, and I'm sure it's been put forward before. I personally would love to see every person, every patient have their own digital data donor card where all their digital data is stored. Mm-hmm. There's a common core data collection which I pinched actually from Karen Facey, who spoke earlier. I think it's a brilliant idea. But if you have like a data donor card, which is then you have the sovereignty of that data, then you can actually decide data you share with which person or which company, and you could almost sort of scan that data. I had a vision of just like holding it up to a screen, and say you were wanting to take part, for example, in a clinical trial, you held your digital data donor card to the screen, and bingo, your data was then transferred to the. That would then be your choice because it would be because you had the sovereignty of it. Similarly, you can have. I thought I've just written this down in very, very scruffy writing because quite difficult to write when I'm disconnected. But you could have a data passport as well, which should mean when you're traveling abroad, everybody has a passport that travels. So why shouldn't everybody have a health passport, for example? Just
yeah.
Yeah, and
but I think this is of paramount importance, not only to share your data, just if something happens in your health status, right? I think for me, this is a baseline thing.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. Yes, I think the reality is the technology is there. So the possibility is there, because if you think today, you can go with your credit card in any country and you can have access to your full financial information.
Yeah.
So why this can be done with the health information, so that you can have access to your full information at any point in time with a card or a passport, whenever it is done, and you decide how to use this information. The way that today you decide in which bank you put your money and what return you get to the money.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I mean, I've always seen this. It's a great idea, which I've loved for many years. There's a guy called Doc Sells at Harvard who's got the vendor relation management project, which is all about turning the table. So the customer is at the center and the vendors are on the periphery. And the interesting thing there is that I think it almost needs to be like a World Wide Web standard. It's got to be an open standard that is not beholden to a technology company or a country. And it shows you that we need maybe even to change the GDPR legislation and things like that to center it more around individuals more than it is, and protect them in a way that they actually can be have their data portable with them without actually breaking laws either. So it's quite an interesting area. Matt, there's a couple of questions that come in which are more.
Yes, I've noticed. Yeah.
So how can we help patients be more comfortable with digital tools was one. And then the other question, the follow on, which is more around patients, was what do patients care about more? Is it the value chain of AI, RWE helping them, or the regulatory privacy outside quality of the tools? So are patients more interested in privacy and regulation, or the value or the promise of AI, I think is how I would read that.
Yes, yeah. Well, obviously I can't speak for everybody because we're all different, as we've said. Personally, and I'll answer the second question first, but I will get on to the first question. I actually really do value AI and its ability to seek out, because there is so much information available from so many different sources, and it's building on a daily basis. So I personally don't think there's going to be any human out there that will be able to collate all the relevant information in the time that we have, because as I say, our data is massive, and I think Martina's mentioned this before. We need to get our heads together and decide which actual information we're going to use, because otherwise it's going to completely combust the system. So AI is super important. from a personal point of view, if my data can help anybody get help with drug discovery and help other people, then my privacy goes out the window. Once I am gone, I am gone. Yeah. This is my own personal view. I don't feel that, and don't get me wrong, I totally respect people who do want to hold on to their data, and I think, but I'm in my 50s now. I've had Parkinson's for 46 years. The likelihood of me lasting more than I hope this doesn't upset anybody, but the likelihood of me lasting more than another 20 years is pretty slim, just because of the wear and tear of the condition. So I don't mind forgoing my privacy, because there's nothing that can happen to me that hasn't happened already. That's bad. So why don't I share my data with everybody else so it can help other people?
Yeah.
So
No, I think you present a really good point, Matt, which is going to be a challenge as well, because in your situation, I completely understand it's not an unusual story that I've certainly heard with other patients as well.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of patients would empathize with you. And one of the issues we see with cell and gene therapy, for example, where you have maybe a one-off treatment and you get better, but you need to follow up and prove that it works, is that people get disengaged if they're well, right? When we're well, we don't really want to share very much at all. So we need to find these ways, as Javier was saying, which allows us to share, but in a way that is protective and of individuals.
But in this very specific point, I think, Chris, it's when it becomes even more important for a patient to do all these things remotely. Because if the patient is well, I think you cannot ask the patient to travel to on the other side of the country, or or the state or whatever, for a regular health check, right? Then here, telemonitoring, is of paramount importance, right? And this is another thing due to the COVID situation. We have had in my company tremendous changes in clinical trials with things that we thought we could never do before that we're doing now from home, right?
Yes, we have implemented in Seneo, we have implemented a couple of solutions specifically focused on those long-term follow-up for gene therapy and other situations where there is requirement from long-term follow-up, with a design that is focused on the patient. It's a patient-centric design, so making sure that is built, taking into consideration the patient to make this engagement through so long period really easy for the patient. And it's about, as you mentioned, different situations. It's remote monitoring. It's about using, even reducing the number of visits of the patient to the minimum necessary, so that you can bring the visit to the patient. You can have telemedicine, telehealth. You can have home health if required. Data collection that is easy for the patient and for the physician, so it's not disruptive, so that it could be incorporated into day-to-day. So it's not something that creates additional burden for physician and patient. And this is critical to keep this engagement for a long period of time.
But again, here, you need all stakeholders to agree. So we're in Europe, let's say, and you have a risk management plan that maybe is asking for long-term monitoring, but the risk management plans are approved by EMA, but then looked nationally and then approved nationally, right? And then you're gonna say, okay, let's have the smallest amount of visits. And then all of a sudden you have a country that does not accept, right?
Yeah.
And so again here, all stakeholders, right? Eyes wide open on
but you will be surprised how the countries are evolving. So we have seen in the last 6 months a big evolution of different countries where the acceptability of the different components of a virtual approach has been evolving. Some countries doesn't accept most of them, others have said every single component. And what we are pretty clear is this is a pretty dynamic situation, and countries are evolving almost month by month. So you need to keep a continuous track, because as you generate more data that demonstrate that this works and is effective and you got quality and everything, other countries are following. So it's going really fast now.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to bring draw on a point that Matt made about, you know, the promise of AI being able to process all of this data. We did well, I did an analysis on some disease work that we did in a country where we detected patients with a very rare disease from electronic health records, and when we presented the results to the clinician said, well, it's quite clear these patients have disease. We should have seen them. At least 50% of these should have been in the office. Here, you know, it's not that hard. And I said, well, I've just worked out how long it took you to review the few records, and it would have taken over 87 years for a clinician to do it, and would have cost over $100 million to review them. And by 87 years, most of us wouldn't be here anymore. So AI actually does answer the problem. I mean, it really does. You know, you can do all sorts of analysis on it and see. And the fact that it can improve these workflows is actually fundamentally important to patients. And if you can show that and demonstrate that more and more, then I think people will buy into the fact that we need to be able to monitor and follow up and be able to follow in an ethical and a reasonable way the impact of our treatments and of our regimes on you know, the lives of patients and reducing the disease burden. That's going to be just part and parcel of the value proposition to the patient as well. But Matt, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to answer question 3 actually, how to help patients become more comfortable with digital tools. I think you have to realize, I mean, it's all about how the data is eventually going to be used, which we've discussed already, but it's having a shared purpose. The shared purpose is to get you as a patient living your best life. And I think if you can, I mean, I'm not quite sure how much convincing people need for that, because they're wearing these digital tools, for example, or they could be using digital for a reason. And that is to get to make the best use of them as they possibly can. And those that are reluctant, maybe, I mean, I think, as Martine's already said, COVID has accelerated our real introverted look into our own sort of health state. We're looking much more at how we live as people and how much we concentrate on and how important health is. So if we get, I think, at the end of the day, the digital tools aren't there just for the sake of collecting data. They're there to assist you in living your best life. So I think if you can't, I mean, it sounds trivial to say if you can't see the benefit in that, then that's not strictly true. But in my view, digital will help, providing the information is used properly.
Yeah, that's a great point. As we're drawing towards the end of the session, I'm quite happy to go over if anyone from the audience has more questions. But the interesting thing is, I mean, we've talked about some things which are really very progressive. You know, the edge of what's happening digitally I would say in biopharmaceuticals per se. So in other words, I think we're saying that rare diseases and the rare disease community as a whole are at the forefront of what the future of biopharmaceuticals is going to be.
Totally.
Yeah, which is pretty awesome, really.
Yeah.
Think about it. And so while people have, you know, always seen rare diseases as margins, I think it's what's driving really the path to the future for all biopharmaceutical development.
Yeah, but I think, Chris, the FDA is advanced here because, as you know, when we present the development program to the agency, right, they ask us to share what we discussed with the patients. You know, what's your patient engagement program? So, and we know for a long time the patients are part of the committees, decision-making committees in Europe. So yeah, the center is there, which is absolutely what it needs to be. Yeah. And this is why we're here today and in a very collaborative mode.
No, absolutely. It's exciting. It's I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to everyone. To prepare for this and meet you all has been really a great experience. And I hope that we all stay in touch. And I'm gonna wrap up because we're just running towards the bottom of the hour, and I like to be on time. But thank you very much to everyone, for all the panelists in this session. Thank you to the audience. If you've got any other questions, anything else that you'd like to ask us, please feel free to get in contact us via Terrapin, the conference organizers, or you can find our details. I'm sure you'll be able to find us on LinkedIn or wherever you want to find us. And if there's anything that I need to ask any of the co-panelists, if you ask me a question, I'm quite happy to reach out to them. I'm sure we'll be staying in touch. But I do want to thank all the audience. I do want to thank everyone who is working in rare diseases for being here and for working on these especially challenging problems, and for all of the insights that we've got here. So hopefully it was of value. It'll be goodbye from me. I'll let everyone else say goodbye.
I think we're all smiling, so I think that's a real good way of saying this has been a complete and utter success. So I'd like to thank you, Chris, Martine and Javier, and the audience for having me, because it's been a real pleasure taking part.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.